Welcome to Automedics with Kunle Shonaike. Today's topic, we're talking about the falsehood and facts about overheating. You know, when people talk about overheating or the misconception we have about overheating is most drivers believe that when their needle or the temperature gauge of their vehicle, it's towards the middle point of the gauge, they see it as overheating, which in the normal sense really is your normal optimum temperature should be the middle point of the gauge or a little bit above normal. When your temperature of your vehicle is way below the middle point, that means that engine is still in an open loop situation. What do I mean by an open loop situation? The computer and all the monitoring sensor is still saying the engine has been cold, which means it needs more fuel to run or to keep the engine running at optimum idle speed or optimum speed depending on the load on the engine. Whereas the engine could have been at an optimum temperature because of the compromise that's been done to the engine. In Nigeria here, most especially in some parts of Africa, we believe that the temperature gauge should be below, way below at the cold level where you will normally have C. When it gets to H, that's the high point. The H will be the high, which will be the red point. The cold point or the cool point will be the C. But the normal operating temperature should be the midpoint, which in normal times it's about 90 to 100 degrees centigrade or 210 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the optimum working temperature of an average engine of a vehicle. Anything below that or below 180, the computer sees your engine as running cold. And running cold means you're burning more fuel. You go to some mechanics, immediately they see your temperature gauge, they say your vehicle hasn't been tropicalized or your engine needs to be tropicalized. And the first thing they do is remove your thermostat or direct your fan or change your radiator to double cell or do all three at the same time, which is in a way, it's a disservice to the engine and to your pocket also, because what you're doing is costing yourself more money because you're spending more money buying fuel. Now let's break it down. Your vehicle, when you start it in the morning, or if the vehicle has been sitting for a couple of hours that the engine is very cold, and what I mean by cold is the engine is way below about 40 to 60 degrees centigrade or about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That means the engine is still running cold at that time. There are some sensors on the engine. One critical is the electronic coolant temperature sensor. What this sensor is doing is anytime you're starting the engine, immediately you turn the key on, the sensor picks up the temperature of the engine at that time. How does it pick up the temperature of the engine? You know, coolant is flowing in the engine. The sensor is inserted into the engine, tightened into the engine. And where it protrudes out of the engine into the internal part of the engine, it protrudes into the water jacket. The sensor is actually making contact with the coolant, with the water, whatever you want to call it, but I will call it coolant for the purpose of this topic. The sensor is actually touching the coolant, and it's like you putting a thermostat in a boiling water. The sensor takes a temperature of that coolant at that time, send a report back to the computer that this engine is at this temperature. The computer looks at the temperature and says, well, this engine is cold. So when the engine is cold, I need to give it more fuel. How does it give it more fuel? It increases the pulse width, the time it takes for the injector to open and close. It increases the time That means the injector will open longer. So the amount of fuel being dumped into the engine will commensurate with the coldness of the engine at that time. So it will burn more fuel so that the engine can quickly warm up. Now, when you compromise this system, for example, you remove the thermostat. If you remove the thermostat, at that time, the water is just flowing around in the engine, So it takes longer for the engine to warm up. Whereas when the thermostat is there and it's working properly, when the engine is closed, the thermostat stays closed. As the engine is warming up, when it gets to a certain amount of temperature, an average thermostat will open at about 180 degrees to 210 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about between 90 and 100 degrees centigrade. The thermostat will start to open at that time, and it stays open as long as that temperature is maintaining that 210 degrees, or between 180 and 210 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermostat stays open, so it allows the coolant to flow through in the engine. As the coolant is flowing through the engine, it goes through the engine, pulls the heat out of the engine block. You know, it's coolant, it's water. It pulls the heat out of the engine block and the cylinder head. The water pump pushes the water into the radiator. As the water is going into the radiator, your radiator fan is turning. And the way the radiator fan turns is, it pulls the heat towards the engine. And how does it do it? Mind you, you have the front grille of the vehicle. The outside air, which is the ambient air temperature here, it's been pulled from the outside by the fan, pulled through the radiator, and that air, cool air being pulled through the radiator, cools the coolant in the radiator. The cooled coolant is now pushed back into the engine, so it's going in cycle. Now, let's see a situation where you've removed the thermostat. Now, you compromise the fan, you direct the fan. The fan is running constantly. Immediately you turn the key on. So there's two things happening now. The thermostat is not there or being compromised. The fan is running direct. So instead of the water to warm up, the fan is constantly cooling the water. So it's not even allowing it, because the little one, the warm coolant that's going through the engine, because the thermostat is open, is now being cooled by the fan, because the fan is direct. It now pushes it. So the computer is still saying the it has been cold. In this situation, you have compromised the engine, because the engine is now running cool. It's now running cold because it's not getting to the optimum working temperature. That's 2 points I've raised now. Now, the third compromise that you've done to it is you've now increased the volume of coolant that the engine will take by increasing the volume of the radiator. When you change the radiator to a double cell, which is a larger radiator, that means the amount of water or coolant that the radiator needs to cool or the thermostat needs to hold, it's now more than what it's supposed to take. So it takes longer for the water to warm up. And you'll be complaining that your engine is burning too much fuel. Because the sensor is sending a signal to the computer that the engine has not warmed up, it's going to keep burning more fuel. And if you look at your temperature gauge will be way below the middle point. When it's way below the middle point, that means you're burning excessive fuel, because it's saying it has not been warm, the engine is not warm, and at this stage, it keeps burning fuel. When you change this thing or you compromise this thing, it affects your bottom line, which is your pocket. So the way to go about it is, the way these things are designed is, the thermostat is only supposed to open at a certain temperature and close it at a certain temperature. Your radiator fan will only come on, which if it's an electric fan, it's only supposed to come on at a certain temperature. There's a sensor that will trigger the fan also to come on at a certain time, cool the coolant or the water to a certain level, Once it cools down to a certain level, it goes up because the sensor is monitoring the temperature. It cuts it on and off. Then the third one is the radiator that comes with the engine is been designed that whichever region the vehicle is, that thermostat, the radiator will be able to take that punishment. The only time you change or compromise this thing is when they're faulty. For example, if you're traveling or you're going somewhere, you discover that your thermostat will not open. Yes, you can remove it temporarily to get to where you're going or to move yourself around, because thermostat will only go bad in two ways. It's either it's stuck closed or stuck open. The dangerous one is when it's stuck closed, because it won't allow the coolant to flow through the engine. Or your fan, it's either not working or you've directed the fan that is constantly working. Whichever way, it's not good for the engine. When it's not working, the engine tends to overheat because it's not cooling the coolant. It's not pulling the heat out of your radiator, which is the heat exchanger. So these are some of the things that you need to be aware of when you are going to your mechanic and he says, oh, your engine or your vehicle needs to be tropicalized. Don't allow him or her to remove the thermostat. All you have to do is tell him to check if it's bad, replace it. There's so many ways you can test it, but that will be another topic. Or if your fan is not working, it can replace or repair the fan, the thermostat, the radiator. If the radiator is leaking, it can replace it. And if you have a leak in your system, it's easy to check. All he has to do is use a coolant pressure tester to pressurize the cooling system to find out where the leak is. The leak could be internal or external. External you will be able to see, because the external you will see the water dropping or the coolant dropping somewhere around the engine. Or if it's internal, you will see it mixing with the oil, or it will be drying up constantly. So in other words, changing or compromising this thing, it's very dangerous to your engine, because when you burn excessive fuel, you tend to build up so much sludge or carbon in your engine, which will still affect the engine. This is all we can take on this topic on Automedics until I come back your way with more interesting topics. I'm still yours, Kunle Shonaike, the auto expert.